Okay, the next speaker is Reverend James D. Heiser, and he's going to speak on Is Mars Exploration Virtuous? So give him a warm welcoming.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
It's good to be with all of you again. As the possibility of human exploration of Mars comes closer to becoming a reality, and I just blew all of your hair back. Sorry, did I mention I usually speak without a microphone? Debates about the ethics or morality of such exploration seem to have become a cottage industry of late for scientists and others who desire to play at roles as ethicists, philosophers, or theologians. Consider, for example, a 2015 article for Space.com entitled "The Ethics of Mars Exploration, Q&A with Luciana Volkowitz." Volkowitz is a research astronomer at the Adler Planetarium in Chicago and was recently named as the chair in astrobiology for the Klug Center at the Library of Congress, working on a project titled "Fear of a Green Planet, Inclusive Systems of Thought for Human Exploration of Mars." But when Space.com asked a fairly elementary question, what do you think is the most important aspect of the ethics of Mars exploration? Volkowitz punted with an invocation of inclusivity and vague hand-waving about narratives, declaring as follows: to the simple question, what is the most important aspect of ethics of Mars exploration? I would say the most important aspect, what really draws me to this particular line of research, is the opportunity to closely examine our past history so that we can move forward in a way that is more inclusive for our future. I think that a lot of the ways we can currently speak about exploration draw on narratives that were very harmful in the past. The comparisons that are so often invoked to Christopher Columbus are a good example where we constantly recycle these narratives from history that were actually quite harmful and were histories of exploitation. So we can move forward to trying to explore places like Mars. I'm curious as to how we can acknowledge these harmful past events and move forward in a way that is more inclusive for everyone who might choose to explore the universe, whether by leaving Earth or by studying it here. End quote. Now, in fairness to Volkowitz, lacking a professional background in history, ethics, philosophy, or theology, such a non-responsive answer is not surprising. But vague invocations of inclusivity and denunciation of harmful narratives do not an ethical system make. An angrier denunciation of space exploration and settlement comes from Linda Billings, a research professor at George Washington University's School of Media and Public Affairs. In an article entitled, "Should Humans Colonize Other Planets? No," Billings judges the... I just love when we, thank you for sparing me the trouble of having to worry about the content of the article, except I have to care. Billings judges the nascent spacefaring nations and finds them unworthy, declaring, and I quote, "The current state of human society gives no indication that we are any better equipped today than they were 500 years ago to accomplish such goals. In its current state of moral development, the author finds humankind unfit to engage in the colonization of other planets in the exploitation of outer space resources." End quote. Dr. Voltamata got to torture me earlier with the revelation that when you contact NASA and ask them for their contact person on space and religion, they apparently send you to Dr. Billings, who has no background, again, to the best of my knowledge, in philosophy, history, theology, ethics. She's a media person, which is a noble profession, but doesn't prepare one to be an ethicist and to declare judgment on the entire human race as to their unworthiness of going to the stars. Now, I could continue with examples of such splenetics ad nauseum, but the cases just cited are sufficient for our purposes. Contra Volkowitz and Billings, the human race has devoted a great deal of energy to the study of questions of ethics and human action. This presentation will be from the perspective of virtue ethics, as opposed to consequentialism or deontology. Therefore, in assessing the question of whether or not it is ethically defensible to explore or even colonize Mars, we are concerned with the question of whether such activities are virtuous. Toward this end, a distinctly Christian perspective on the question under consideration will be held for the conclusion. We'll begin with the Stoics of antiquity, since they are particularly noteworthy for their extensive thought in the realm of virtue ethics, and their observations have much to teach us. A standard definition of virtuous is having or exhibiting virtue. That's one of those definitions that doesn't necessarily shed a lot of light, but is nevertheless entirely true. Having virtue is something which requires a more careful definition. In his work On Ends, Cicero makes a distinction between two main classes of virtues, and he defines them as follows. One class consists of those excellences which are implanted by their own nature, and which are called non-volitional, and the other are those which, depending on our volition, are usually styled virtues in the more special sense, and the latter are the preeminent glory and distinction to the mind. To the former class belong receptiveness and memory, and practically all the excellencies of this class are included under one name of talent, and their possessors are spoken of as talented. The other class consists of the lofty virtues properly so called, which we speak of as dependent on volition. For instance, prudence, temperance, courage, justice, and others of the same kind. Niels Hemmingsen observes that in the proper sense, Cicero defines arete in the following way. Virtue is a habit of the mind consistent with nature, moderation, and reason. The ancients, moreover, define it thus. Virtue is the art of living well and correctly. To this is opposed vice, kakia, a habit of the mind that, according to the judgment of nature, conflicts with right reason. And just as virtue unites the minds of men to each other and adapts them to one another's mutual uses, as has been said, so vice alienates the minds of men and turns them away from one another's mutual uses. Therefore, as nature dictates that the former must be sought, so she also instructs us that the latter must be avoided. End of quote. In a very concrete sense, the cultivation of virtue is therefore about confronting the world as it actually exists in a way which is moral and comports with sound reason. Vice is a habit which is not only contrary to nature, it is contrary to reason. In this context, Cicero spoke of virtue consisting, therefore, of three properties. And I quote, indeed, virtue in general may be said to consist almost wholly in three properties. The first is the ability to perceive what in any given instance is true and real, what its relations are, its consequences, and its causes. The second is the ability to restrain the passions and make the impulses obedient to reason. And the third is the skill to treat with consideration and wisdom those with whom we are associated, in order that we may, through their cooperation, have our natural wants supplied in full and overflowing measure, that we may ward off any impending trouble, avenge ourselves upon those who have attempted to injure us, and visit them with such retribution as justice and humanity will permit. End quote. A rather harsh virtue. In short, virtue sees the world as it really is and takes cause and effect into account, reining in emotional responses and subjecting one's thoughts and actions to reason while showing consideration and wisdom in a relation with other human beings to allow for an ordered society which ensures justice, which comports with sound reason. For Cicero, this means being subject to law which comports with natural law, which he defines as a law which, and I quote, is not written but born, we did not learn, receive, and read it, but we seized, plucked, and wrested from nature herself. For this we were not taught but made. We know it not by training, but by instinct. Traditionally, four cardinal virtues were identified by the ancients: prudence, justice, temperance, and fortitude. Thus, for example, we find this enumeration in Plato's Republic and Cicero's De Officiis. In his Rhetoric, Aristotle expands on this list to enumerate the virtues as justice, courage, temperance, magnificence, magnanimity, liberality, gentleness, prudence, and wisdom. However, for our purposes, we will focus on the four virtues and especially emphasize prudence, for as Menander declared, prudence is always the greatest good. The Liddell Scott Dictionary, Standard Greek Reference, defines phronesis, or prudence, as practical wisdom, which seems an apt definition for prudence. In his work on invention, Cicero defines prudence as follows. Prudence is the knowledge of things which are good or bad, or neither good nor bad. Its parts are memory, intelligence, and foresight. Memory is that faculty by which the mind recovers the knowledge of things which have been. Intelligence is that by which it perceives what exists at present. And foresight is that by which anything is seen to be about to happen before it does happen. Hemmingsen explains Cicero's threefold division of prudence as follows. Memory is the virtue by which the mind revisits the things that have been. This is reckoned part of prudence for the following reason, because the experience of many things is required for deliberating prudently. and one cannot have this without the memory of things past. For experience, as Aristotle says, results from numerous memories, so to speak. Understanding is the virtue by which the mind perceives the things that are, or it is the perception itself of the mind. Its office is twofold. One is that by which we grasp or perceive simple things absolutely. The other is that by which we compare among themselves the things that have been understood and form a judgment about them. Whence we compose some things in making affirmation, we divide others in making denial, and we deduce some from others by reason. Mind, sense perception, imagination, and experience are servants to understanding. Without this understanding, prudence is not able to protect its own name. Foresight is the virtue by which some future thing is seen before it is done. To it is opposed improvidence. This causes us not to foresee future things by our planning, which is, according to the expression of Seneca, the eyes of future things. It is the duty of foresight to ponder and form a judgment about future things from things past and present, and to fortify the mind in advance with early planning before a person arrives at the reality of the future. End quote. To foresight, therefore, Hemmingson concludes, must also be referred diligence, which is prudence in foreseeing the end and the means to the end, in the application of the mind obtaining and maintaining those means. Or it is the deliberation concerning the end and concerning the means, and a sort of exertion of the will and constancy in maintaining the means. Okay, so I think the ramifications and the cultivation of prudence for space exploration and colonization should be quite clear. The application of memory set forth the history of the human race as one which has steadily expanded throughout the habitable zones of Earth. Indeed, it has involved the development of technologies which have redefined the areas which human beings have viewed as habitable. Understanding requires that we view the world as it is. The human race will not accept a diminished standard of living. Human civilization will continue to require an expanding supply of resources. This is not a matter of Western civilization. Rather, virtually the entire human race has rising material expectations which will settle for nothing less than ever-expanding prosperity. Therefore, foresight and diligence require that we extrapolate from current circumstances and see the possible futures which are in front of us. Either resources are viewed in terms of a zero sum, in which case the use of physical coercion, intimidation, and propaganda will be expanded to diminish access to resources per capita, or terrestrial and extraterrestrial access to resources will have to be expanded to meet perceived needs. It is prudent that humanity develop means to explore the solar system and utilize the resources available therein, because this is the path to the future which does not require the forcible reduction either in human numbers or per capita resource utilization, or both. As regards justice, Hemmingson summarizes its duties as follows. The first duty that belongs to justice is that no one harm anyone. The second is that we render to each and every person what is his own. The third is that we refer all things to the common welfare. Justice upholds the individual and the entirety of society by preserving that which is the rightful domain of each. Therefore, Cicero sees a close correlation between justice and fortitude. And again, to quote, and again, as swarms of bees do not gather for the sake of making honeycomb, but make the honeycomb because they are gregarious by nature, so human beings, and to a much higher degree, exercise their skills together in action and thought because they are naturally gregarious. And so, if that virtue, which is justice, which centers in the safeguarding of human interests, that is, in the maintenance of human society, were not to accompany the pursuit of knowledge, that knowledge would seem isolated and barren of results. In the same way, courage or fortitude, if unrestrained by the uniting bonds of society, would be but a sort of brutality and savagery. Hence it follows that the claim of human society and the bonds that unite men together take precedence of the pursuit of speculative knowledge. End quote. Courage is employed, therefore, in the classic sense, in that which preserves human society, and that courage is displayed in guarding against injustice, restraining the aggression of hostile nations, and expanding the resources which serve the entirety of society. However, justice sets a limit to the actions which can be taken in defense even of society, as determined by temperance, and I quote again from Cicero. For there are some acts either so repulsive or so wicked that a wise man would not commit them even to save his country. The The wise man, therefore, will not think of doing any such thing for the sake of his country, no more will his country consent to having it done for her." End quote. Examined in the light of the virtues, the question of whether or not the exploration and colonization of Mars is virtuous in the classical sense can be answered when one examines the motivations for such action and the discrete steps which are contemplated in the course of carrying out such action. Vague invocations of inclusivity, dangerous narratives, and hand-wringing about society's moral development are not a substitute for actually engaging the issues under consideration. An argument can be sustained from the standpoint of virtue, which virtually necessitates ongoing efforts to improve access to raw materials needed for a thriving global economy. Blanket restrictions on development of terrestrial resources, for example, restrictions on mining, agriculture, carbon emissions are all examples, while excluding the utilization of extraterrestrial resources means dooming billions of human beings to a diminished standard of living. It increases the injustice which accompanies competition for restricted resources. Prudence informs the rational mind that such resources need to be developed before the crises come. As Demosthenes observed in the 4th century BC, "For cautious and circumspect men, there is nothing so terrible that it cannot be guarded against beforehand, nor anything evil that cannot happen to the incautious and the sluggish." Now, if we'd only convince Congress of that simple truth. When the motivation for such development is something which benefits the human race, the virtue, therefore, is self-evident. Thus, the tie-in with the Christian faith. Christians are chastened with regard to the stewardship of that which is their own for the needs of others, beginning with the brethren. By this we know love, because he laid down his life for us, and we also ought to lay down our lives for the brethren. But whoever has this world's goods and sees his brother in need and shuts up his heart from him, how does the love of God abide in him? My little children, let us not love in word or in tongue, but in deed and in truth. 1 John 3. And again, what does it profit, my brethren, if someone says he has faith but does not have works? Can faith save him? If a brother or sister is naked and destitute of daily food, and one of you says to them, "Depart in peace, be warmed and filled," but you do not give them the things which are needed for the body, what does it profit? Presented with the question, "Teacher, which is the great commandment of the law?" Jesus said to him, "You shall love the Lord your God with all of your heart, with all of your soul, and with all of your mind. This is the first and great commandment, and the second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these 2 commandments hang all of the law and the prophets." True love of one's fellow human being is always subordinate to and dependent on love of God in such an understanding. And where such love fails, there is a need for repentance. But human beings cannot live as atomistic individuals. We are knit together into communities, and we owe to all the members of our community the exercise of the virtues. We will be imperfect in such duty, and thus there is an ongoing need for restoration. But the exploration and colonization of a new world is an opportunity for an expression of such virtue, and approached as such a solemn responsibility, we may set forth. Thank you. Yes, sir.
I just came from a lecture where it was proposed that all male colonists be vasectomized to prevent the evolution of the species on Mars, because we didn't know what it would be. Is that a virtuous position to take?
And thus he stood upon the shore with a bucket holding back the tide. Considering that what is being proposed is essentially the termination of human biology, I have a hard time taking such a proposal as being even credible. I can't imagine human beings consenting to that decision being made for them. There are many substantial ethical questions, involved in settling on a new world. Some of these we were actually discussing at lunch in terms of, I think that there's a need to study prospects for mammalian reproduction in a low-gravity environment, in an environment in which there's not a magnetic field. There's a lot of factors involved, and you can't just sort of say, well, let's take human beings and, well, we'll see whether or not they survive. But that's a separate ethical question from one which says, well, good heavens, there might be some different development of humanity on a different world. First, I don't think that's necessarily an evidence. We've experienced a lot of different environments here on Earth without having rather dramatically changed in terms of overall physiology. Cro-Magnon is considered to be rather stable across the course of a rather extended period of time. So apparently AC has not caused us to develop. I'm not too much worried about that. But the thing is, if we're going to modify naturally according to an environment, you can't stop that, and you shouldn't stop that. What you should worry about is whether or not you're behaving in a way which is unethical toward those who might be born in such an environment. And I'm more concerned about the ethical issues of, if you are born on another world, can you ever return to the home world, than I am about possible directions that, quote-unquote, evolution might take. But that's just me. Does that answer sufficiently? Okay. Okay. Sorry, I'm speaking macros. Yes, please.
So if I understand correctly, your argument about the virtuousness of space exploration revolves in part around bringing more resources to be available to the human community, which I don't disagree with, but what kind of consideration do we have to take into account for the way that we handle resources as a human community at the moment in this very kind of unequal way, it's a very consumerist way in the West particularly.
Though not only in the West, since most of the other cultures seem to be aspiring not to demonstrate the incorrectness of the Western way, but rather to adopt that mode of life as quickly as they can. It is not as if you have the teeming masses of, fill-in-the-blank country saying, well, good heavens, we've certainly learned from that, and we shall never have electricity in our country, nor, internal combustion engines, etc. I entirely agree that there is a need for a better understanding of resources and to wisely limit pollution and seek a greater economy of the resources we have. But what we found is that, generally speaking, large numbers of human beings do not gently accede to restrictions on reproduction or asset utilization. And although we may be more efficient in our construction of such things, I think that it would be immoral to either deprive those who currently enjoy such resources of the continued use of them, or to say, well, it's all well and good that in first world countries we enjoy certain luxuries, but for the sake of the human race, you of this country or this continent can't have those good things. Sorry about that. So I think that one of the things you see is that as the technology keeps moving forward, we learn a greater efficiency in the way that we use the resources. Nevertheless, things like energy usage continue to spiral up at an astoundingly fast rate. So that's part of the dilemma. So what I would say is prudence would dictate that you're not likely to see that fundamental human behavior change voluntarily. And since I don't think any of us want a omnicompetent totalitarian state capable of saying, oh no, these are the resources allotted for you. Some might posit that, but I'm willing to bet that the majority would not accede to that. It means we have to keep growing the pie. Please.
So if we go back in time and have a chat with Christopher Columbus and our ancestors that went across the western plains and the first colonists, all of them would have seen their actions in extremely virtuous lights.
Mm-hmm.
And we look back on some aspects of their behaviors and realize that in our understanding that many of the things they did were not very virtuous at all.
Right.
How do we avoid those blind spots as we move forward?
I would say develop criteria like this for examining your proposed course of action. There was a measure of that, and what I would say is things were by no means as bad as they could have been, nor were they in every detail according to the imagination of moderns who want to recast past history. But there's a matter of conscience in it. Human beings have an obligation not to act contrary to conscience. And that's why an educated conscience in the principles of natural law and morality is vital to forming proper decision-making processes in this. I mean, I know we keep joking about how, do no harm to the aliens unless they taste good, but that's the kind of area where it should inform our assessment, and the failures of previous generations to do as thorough of a job ethically as they might have done if, they were only as wise and had the advantage of 500 years of hindsight as we do. I know that's not what you're positing, but that's what you see going on. I see as more of an occasion for us to be concerned with learning from that experience and less obsessed with uncovering the nakedness of Noah, to call to mind one biblical example. Don't mock your ancestors. If you find them to have failed, then don't repeat their failure. Because don't worry, you're a human being. You will come up with an awesome set of failures all your own. Yeah, it's one of the reasons why, just in my personal assessment, Billings's denunciation of human exploration and colonization is ethically absurd, because you will never reach a state of moral perfection. Therefore, according to her criteria, we'll never go anywhere. I think I've got allowance for time for one more question, perhaps. I know the last one was a little bit long, so any other questions? Or are we done? Thank you.